There's nothing quite like a handcrafted Berger deck. Not too long ago, I did a Giant Skeleton Double Witch clone deck, and in fact, recently, that's a very deck that I used for the Lumberjack Rush challenge to get those log emotes. So tonight, I'm bringing you guys a great variation of this deck for classic and grand challenges as well as ladder. It includes the Lumberjack since you don't get it from that Lumberjack Rush challenge. It also includes the Goblin Hut, which was recently buffed. Alright guys, I got a ton of replays for you tonight. I'm not going to be doing any live matches with this particular deck, at least not in this video, maybe in a future one I will. But we're going to be looking at a bunch of replays and I'm really going to break down the strategies that I use to succeed with this deck. So, as I mentioned, this is a handcrafted deck. It wasn't found on Royale API or Stats Royale or Deck Shop or anything like that. Generally, I get my decks from one of those sites, or maybe from like a CWA video or something. You know, I like to play popular decks, but occasionally I also like to play off-meta decks and craft my own decks. And one of the most successful decks that I ever had was actually a Giant Skeleton Double Witch clone deck. And since the Giant Skeleton as well as the Witch recently got a buff in this last patch, and on top of that, the clone also recently, not too long ago, not in this last patch, but recently got a buff as well, and it's become a lot more meta in the past month or so, I decided to give it another swing, give it a try, and I've been having a surprising amount of success with it. So this one, as I mentioned earlier, or maybe I haven't talked about it yet, this one incorporates the Lumberjack and the Goblin Hut. Now, if you were playing this deck or a similar deck in the Lumberjack Rush trying to get those log emotes, then you don't have to include that Lumberjack, but I wanted to have him in there because it synergizes really well with the clone spell, and it's just great to have a really high DPS mini tank kind of unit in there. I guess not really a mini tank, but melee unit, and in this similar thought of a mini tank. Alright guys, so what about the Goblin Hut in there? Well, the Goblin Hut, it was recently buffed in the last patch, and it actually ends up working out surprisingly well. I mean, it's just having a spawner building, other than, Tombstone, if you even count that, is really good because it gives you a consistent stream of damage that your opponent has to answer with something. You invest 5 elixir or so into that Goblin Hut, and each time the Spear Goblin spawns, it's gonna get at least a little bit, at least one hit of its auto attack off onto the opponent's tower, assuming that your opponent doesn't answer it. If your opponent answers it and counters it with something, then of course they're gonna have invested that extra elixir into it, so it's gonna put them in a deficit. Alright, so it works out surprisingly well because it allows you to build up that stream of units and of DPS, and if you've got something tanking in front of it, then in front of the Spear Goblins, then you can use them as like your ranged support unit, and you can also clone them if you've got a whole bunch of them grouped up. After the hut has spawned a couple, even just 1 or 2 or 3 clone units can be really beneficial and can increase your DPS output by a whole lot. So you can definitely get those Spear Goblins grouped up and clone them all with that clone spell. Now, one thing that I want to point out, it's really important to know for this deck, is that there's no big spell in this deck. All you have is the clone, the giant snowball, and the tornado. So since you don't have a big spell or a medium spell, a few things that you need to keep in mind. You do need to be careful for elixir pumps. So I think I'm going to share like a 3 Musketeers replay in a little bit here. This one is against the Giant deck, Giant Prince deck, and you need to watch out for those elixir pumps, even against, whether it's, a Golem or 3 Musketeers or whatever it may be, because you don't have anything to sufficiently answer it. Let's see. Let me get my sound fixed here real quick. I think I was a little late with this, but it's never too late to get a little bit of Clash audio going in the background here. Alright guys. So, on top of that, you don't have any real late game tower finisher. So you don't have any potential to finish off their tower, their Princess Tower, their King Tower, whatever it may be, with, your rocket or your fireball or your poison or whatever it may be. So do keep that in mind. Watch out for these things. Watch out for elixir pumps, and don't get yourself caught in a situation where you need to finish off the tower with a little bit of extra chip damage and you don't have anything to do so. I mean, that's kind of inevitably going to happen with this deck because of the play style of it, and I do want to talk about that next. it's kind of played like a control slash beatdown deck. Since you don't have any heavy spells or light spells, you're really relying on connecting to their tower with one big clone push, or maybe two, maybe a little bit of chip damage here and there, but that's pretty much it. So there's a lot of defensive potential. You got the Goblin Hut, so you got that spawner building. It attracts hog riders and giants and all kinds of things like that. So it's definitely a very good card on defense, and it provides that consistent stream of units, as I mentioned earlier, to provide a bunch of damage output onto their towers. And you've got, the giant skeleton. If you're not too familiar with him, he's a defensive powerhouse. You can use him on defense, and then he'll die, and his bomb will pretty much kill almost anything. That was a pretty poor bomb on my part. I was trying to pull them all in, or poor tornado, excuse me. Pull them all into the king tower, or the princess tower, and then, get the giant skeleton up there so that he would do damage to the princess tower as well with his bomb, but it didn't work out too well. If you do want to tornado stuff into your giant skeleton, that's a huge play that you can do. Another massive defensive play that you can make. It's a full 9 elixir, but if they have a huge golem or giant push coming down, if you giant skeleton, let the bomb die, and then tornado everything onto the bomb, that'll kill pretty much any support unit and do a huge chunk of damage to any tank. I mean, it's not going to take a golem out, but it'll take out pretty much anything behind him. So there is this huge snowball potential, and that's pretty much going to be your win condition. You don't really have classic or traditional win condition in this deck. It really relies on that big push. You don't have like a giant or a golem or a hog rider or a balloon or anything that goes straight for the tower. It's mostly kind of like these weird defensive control units, and it's one of those decks that I think can pull it off because it's so off meta. It's so weird, they don't know what to expect, and occasionally you can just get a giant skeleton onto their tower, clone it, and that tower is as good as gone. So play it kind of like a control deck, and then when you get the opportunity, you can go in for a big beatdown push. The giant skeleton, I put him up there in front. He can be used as a tank. Alright, here we go, connected to the tower there, as you can see. He can be used as like a big tank in front, but he can also generally just be used on defense. I don't cycle him in back too much unless I'm really using or looking for something to get out of my hand and to spend some elixir, but I will use him at the bridge occasionally. Alright guys, here is that Three Musketeers replay, and he has elixir pump in this deck. So as you can see, there's not really going to be anything that I can do to it, so I'm going to have to rely on going in for big pushes and trying to take out his towers rather than trying to counter his elixir pump. What else do I want to talk about here? The giant skeleton, as I mentioned, generally he's going to be used on defense, but I just want to reiterate that you can use him as a tank because you don't have like an ice golem or a giant or anything like that in this deck. You don't even really have a mini tank other than like the Lumberjack or arguably maybe the Night Witch. So it's kind of going to be that giant skeleton that you rely on for the tank. If he does reach the tower again, that's massive damage, so that's when you really want to use your clone. So don't be afraid to clone even just the giant skeleton if he gets in within tower range. And now the clone skip does it north-south or up-down rather than left-right, so you can actually advance him a little bit close to the tower if you clone him, if I'm not mistaken. And then of course if both of the giant skeleton bombs, the regular one and the clone one, drop within tower range, that tower will be brought down to nearly dead. It won't completely kill it, but it'll bring it down super, super low. Alright, so giant skeleton, kind of your main tank, but also used primarily on defense and going in for a counter push. Once you get into double elixir, you can use him a little bit more aggressively, or if you've got excess elixir and you've got like a witch or a night witch built up in the back, you can use him at the bridge kind of aggressively. Otherwise, keep in mind he's a huge defensive card, so don't be afraid to use him on defense. Let him die, take advantage of that bomb. So for the clone, generally you're going to be saving it, you're going to be hanging tight until you get close to their tower with your giant skeleton and your night witch and your witch or whatever it may be. Pretty much every unit in this deck can really benefit from the clone. And the reason that witch is in here, well, she was pretty decent with the clone already, but now that she got that buff in the last patch where she spawns skeletons upon her death, just like the night witch spawns bats upon her death, I mean, she's even better with the clone. Anything that has like a death effect just is amplified with the clone effect, essentially. I mean, it just really takes good advantage of that clone effect, because you know the clone units are gonna die really easily. They die pretty much one shot to anything, right? I think unless they're shielded or something like that. So if they're guaranteed to die, you can take advantage of them, get huge value with a big death effect. So as soon as the witch dies, she spawns 3 skeletons. If you've got a cloned witch, that's another 3 skeletons. So that's already 6 right there. Plus if they got a chance to spawn 3 each already just from their regular spawn thing, then that's another 6, so that's 12 total. And then if you get the witch, you know, cloned with the night witch and she's spawning all her bats, it's just absolute mayhem. And then you might have some spear goblins in there. And then of course the lumberjack is going to be there, mostly for that rage effect, but also he can be used on defense, and he can be used kind of aggressively as a mini tank, similar to the giant skeleton, if you don't have enough elixir or if you see an opportune time to do so. Alright guys, this is against that infamous P.E.K.K.A. Ram Rider control deck that was the #1 deck for a little while. I don't think it's as great now in the current meta, but before the patch it was pretty solid. It's probably still a pretty good deck. I think that this guy actually leaves towards the end once I take a tower or so. So if we get to that point and we notice that he's leaving, maybe I'll just kind of zip through the rest of the replay at, you know, quadrupled speed. So anyway, the clone, generally using it for clutch offensive pushes. Since you're going for that big beatdown push, that kind of surprise push in a sense, you can hang on to the clone and never use it until you get that opportune time when your giant skeleton and night witch or whatever are on the opponent's tower, and then you can just, you know, wreak havoc on it with that clone effect. They might not know that you have it, so they may, like, you know, not answer accordingly. They may do something like waste their barbarian barrel before you use your clone or something like that, and then you can clone after and gain huge value from it if they don't know that you have it. And it's still a relatively off meta card, especially if you're playing a weird wonky deck like this that they're not used to seeing. So even right there you can see there's the clone giant skeleton, and look at that tower go down. It's basically dead. They each got like an auto attack or 2 off on it as well, so that brought it even lower than it would have been without those. Now, so mostly you're going to be using it on offense, kind of in clutch opportune times. Once they know that you have it, then they're probably going to be spending a little bit more effort answering it. But, you know, you still can use it on offense. Once they know that you have it, you can still like bait out their spell and then use it right after. Or just wait until the skeleton is close enough to the tower so that it doesn't matter if the clone is instantly killed. You still got that death damage effect. Or, you know, now that the witch spawns skeletons on death, and so does the night witch, of course, then it's like it's not a big deal if they die, because you'll still get, you know, a bunch of units right afterwards. So even if they spell everything, right, if they arrows it all, you're still going to get those extra units afterwards. Now, it can be used on defense. In fact, I posted a good example of it on Reddit not too long ago. It wasn't the best because it was in a draft challenge, but there was like a Royal Giant and P.E.K.K.A. coming down the lane, you know, which you would never see normally, but since it's a draft challenge. And then there was like some Spear Goblins behind it, and I had like Barbarians and Electro Dragon, and I just cloned it all, and it just like shut it down really well. You know, the Chain Lightning splashed the Spear Goblins, and the Royal Giant and the P.E.K.K.A. got melted by the, you know, now 10 Barbarians and the Chain Lightning from the Electro Dragon. So you can really take advantage of it on defense if you need to. This deck doesn't have as much stuff, but I mean, even if you just like clone the witch and back, then the cloned witch is going to be spawning a bunch of skeletons the whole time consistently. Alright, you can see that he pretty much gave up at the end here, so let's go ahead and speed through the end. And I didn't get a chance to finish him off there with a huge clone push, but at least I got my win. Let's go ahead and jump on into another replay. Now, P.E.K.K.A. Control must be like really popular right now, because I'm looking at all these replays and it's like a bunch of different P.E.K.K.A. Control decks. But anyway, maybe that's good, because then you guys will know how to counter it, and you'll see that it's a pretty viable deck in this current meta, the one that we're playing. Alright, so I talked about most things that I wanted to point out. Talked about the clone, talked about the giant skeleton. Let's talk about the witches a little bit. And actually that kind of brings me into opening moves. I like to open with like a witch or night witch and back. The further back you put them, the more units they're going to spawn. You can use them at the bridge or a little bit further up if you want to, but they're not going to have as much chance to spawn, you know, the skeletons and the the bats and everything. And if you clone too early, then your opponent will just, you know, log it or barbarian barrel it or whatever, or arrows it, whatever they may have, and then it'll be a waste. But I mean, it's potential. It has potential for you to use the 2 witches in the back and then just clone them if you want. Lumberjack as well. He can be cloned, and he, you know, when he is cloned, then the clone version will die quicker usually, and then it'll drop that rage effect, and then everything benefits from that rage effect as well as the Lumberjack if he's still alive. And then if the regular Lumberjack dies shortly after, you'll get a second rage effect further up that goes a little bit longer, so you'll get more overall time from it. So just a ton of cards that work really well with that clone effect. So opening moves, like I said, I generally am going to cycle the Night Witch or the Witch in the back. Occasionally I'll actually Goblin Hut as an opener. It's pretty safe to do in that safe spot there, as you can see. So definitely an option if you like to open with your spawner building. I like to use the Witch in the back first because I like to let her build up a ton of skeletons, and then if they decide to spell her out, you'll see what spells they have, and she's pretty beefy, so she doesn't die to, you know, like a, what is it, Fireball Zap. I think she does die to like Poison Log or Fireball Log or something like that, but you know, she's not as squishy as like a Musketeer or something like that. Alright guys, that's pretty much it for opening moves. I wouldn't generally open with a Giant Skeleton unless it's on defense. No need to open with any of your spells. And Lumberjack, he's just kind of a little bit too speedy. You use him on defense usually and then allow him to go in for an offensive counter push. So he's not the most ideal opener. Now let's talk about card replacements. So there's a lot of different things that you could replace in this deck. And I'm just going to kind of wing it on this one because this was a deck that I crafted myself, as I mentioned. And I just went with a bunch of cards that work really well with that clone effect. And if you've watched some of my lava clone videos, you'll know that, you know, sometimes I learned that sometimes having a card that benefits from the clone effect or synergizes really well with the clone, like directly, isn't always the best thing to have in there. Sometimes it's okay to have just some range support cards that you wouldn't think would go well with clone, but can actually work out really great. So like, you know, a Baby Dragon or a Flying Machine stay in the back and provide that single target or that splash damage. You know, you how do I say? Yeah, that's pretty much what I want to say. Single target damage or splash damage, you know, the Flying Machine being the single target and the Baby Dragon being the splash damage. And if they're cloned and they've got something tanking in front of them, those clone units can stay alive and increase your DPS output. So definitely consider doing cards that you might not think would be super benefited from the clone. Swarm units also benefit from clone really well because you can make one skeleton army into 2 skeleton armies really easily. And again, do watch out for their spells. If you know they're running a bunch of spells or they still have their Barbarian Barrel in hand, you don't allow them to, you know, counter a big swarm of units with just a really cheap spell. It's definitely a high risk, high reward card, so do keep that in mind at all times. Alright, so for specific card replacements, let's just work our way from the top left to the bottom right there. For the Snowball, you pretty much want to go with the light spell that's in the current meta. It was Zap for a long time, it was Log for a long time, it was Barbarian Barrel for a little while, and now it's Snowball. So you're pretty much going to be using Snowball because it's the current light spell in the meta. So if you switch it out for something else, just pretty much pick another light spell. That's fine with me. Whatever is popular at the time or whatever is good at the time, really. Goblin Hut, you could easily replace it with like a swarm unit like Goblin Gang or Guards. I was running something like that before and it works out really well. I just ran the Goblin Hut to switch it up, keep it fresh, and use the units or the cards that were buffed in the recent patch. For the Tornado, it's really for that Giant Skeleton Bomb. You can replace it with a few other things. Maybe like a support unit or something like that, you know, like a Baby Dragon. You don't really need another spawner in there, but it's really great on defense. And it can actually be used on offense as well. A big play that you're going to make is pulling all of your opponent's units into their Princess or King Tower. And then your Giant Skeleton will then be allowed to walk up to that tower because it'll be distracted by wherever the units are. And then when it dies, that bomb will do damage to the tower and ideally all the units as well. So the Tornado is not one that I really have too many replacements for. I would say put a defensive unit in there, defensive structure, but you've already got one. So try to run that Tornado if you can. Clone, again, if you take out the clone, then you're really changing this deck. If you want to replace one of those spells, Tornado or Clone, with like a a light spell, or in this case, like a heavy spell or a medium spell like a Fireball or a Rocket, then that would be definitely a viable replacement. But these two spells really kind of fit into this deck really well, especially the Clone. Like if you change the Clone, then you're gonna completely change the archetype of this deck. Alright, now this particular replay, guys, is actually a draw. I just wanted to show you the defensive potential that this deck has, and I come in clutch almost, like I get really close to destroying his tower at one point towards the end, but it's just not quite enough damage. And so I just wanted to point out to you guys and show you like an example of, you know, the defensive potential that this deck has and how you can surprise your opponent and get a clutch like giant skeleton clone off onto their tower and do a ton of damage. So we're going to go ahead and watch it in double speed and maybe quad speed as we get along here if we still need to get through it a little bit quicker. Now for the witch, you could replace her with another range support card, you know. She really benefits from that clone, but you could replace her with like a musketeer, a baby dragon, flying machine. I think flying machine will work out really well in this deck, honestly. Giant skeleton, unfortunately, again, it's like there's so many cards that synergize with clone in this deck that you wouldn't want to swap out. But if you're going for like another tank, you could put a win condition card in there. This deck would work out really well. I'm just looking at it with a heavy tank in there, like a giant or like a golem. If you want to have a little bit of fun, you could try putting in like a hog rider or even like a balloon, because balloon synergizes with clone really well. For the Night Witch, probably just another like kind of mini tank. Another card, that synergizes with clone really well is the Skeleton Barrel. So that's also a viable replacement for like the giant skeleton or maybe the Night Witch. For the Lumberjack, I would just go with like another mini tank. Ice Golem would work out great in there. Maybe even a miner would give you like a pseudo win condition onto their tower. You know, something like that to just kind of play that mini tank role. But again, the Lumberjack gives you that rage effect, so he synergizes with the clone amazingly well. So a lot of these cards, I know I'm like, oh, I'm going to tell you guys card replacements, but a lot of these cards really can't be replaced in this deck because they just synergize with that clone spell really well, and that gives it that overall theme of the deck. But again, take that with a grain of salt, because like if you want to run this deck but you just don't have your witch up to level, or you haven't unlocked Night Witch, like dude, just put a musketeer in there and play the deck. It's totally fine. You're still going to have fun with it. And you may decide that, oh, you like that pretty well, and it works out even better. So definitely some possible card replacements, but when I crafted this deck myself, I really had, you know, clone synergy in mind, as you can probably see. Alright guys, we're wrapping up this last replay here, and I think that is going to be it for tonight's video. So if you're new to the channel and you've made it this far, seriously consider subscribing. I cover, you know, Clash Royale decks, balance changes, things like that all the time. Almost not daily, but you know, a few videos a week generally. So consider subscribing. You can do so by hitting that little Berger down in the box down there, a little drawing that one of my third graders made for me a few years ago. Or you can just, you know, hit the subscribe button somewhere on the channel. Make sure to leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video, because it really helps the channel, and a comment in the comment section below if you want to say hi or have any questions or want to add me as a friend or whatever it may be. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Thanks so much for watching, guys, and have a good night. Roll a quarter